It's 7 o'clock. This is a Sky News special programme on the war in Ukraine. Our top story. At a turning point, the verdict of the Ukrainian president as Russian forces edge closer to Kyiv. Digging in, Ukrainian troops try to hold their lines on the outskirts of the capital. As Kyiv prepares, some major cities, including Dnipro, come under attack for the first time as Russia broadens its assault.
Today they're digging and digging, filling sandbag after sandbag to try to protect these beaches.
We report from the southern city of Odesa, where residents are preparing for a Russian assault. The UN Security Council debates disputed Russian claims that Ukraine is developing chemical weapons, but the US president has a warning of his own for Vladimir Putin.
I'm not going to speak about the intelligence, but Russia would pay a severe price if they use chemical weapons.
Mr. Putin meets his closest ally as the parent company of Facebook and Instagram becomes the latest victim of the Russian clampdown on foreign media. And we report from Poland as the UN says more than 2.5 million refugees have now fled the fighting in Ukraine. A very good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jonathan Samuels, and this is a special programme on the war in Ukraine. The country's President Volodymr Zelenskyy said today that the conflict has now reached a strategic turning point as more major cities across the country become caught up in the Russia offensive. The main focus, however, remains the capital, Kyiv, with Russian forces moving 3 miles closer in the past 24 hours, according to a senior US defence official. Well, let's take a look now at the latest developments. There's been renewed fighting on the outskirts of the capital and in the eastern city of Kyiv, where a psychiatric hospital was hit by a Russian airstrike. There's no word on casualties, but 330 people were at the hospital. Dnipro is the next likely target as Russia's southern offensive moves north. 2 other strikes near airports in the western cities of Lutsk and Ivano-Frankivsk were also reported. Sky's Katerina Ritozzi has the latest on today's developments.
Russia hadn't prepared for this. With guns and anti-tank missiles, Ukrainian forces repel an assault outside of the capital, Kyiv. This firefight was filmed yesterday. This is payback for the bombing of Mariupol, this soldier says. According to British intelligence, unexpected Ukrainian ground resistance is limiting the progress of Russia's forces. The foreign fighters amongst them seen by Russia as Western provocation.
Regarding the gathering mercenaries from around the world for Ukraine, we see them. The Western sponsors of the Ukrainian regime do not keep it secret. They do it openly, disregarding international law.
But how long can this resistance hold out? Ukraine's president today made a heartfelt appeal to the war-weary.
I know many people are feeling tired now. I understand it. I understand it's all about emotions, and it's life when we mobilise our efforts and when we can see that we can win. We expect the enemy to fall quicker, but the truth is, in this war, the fight, we need more time. We need more patience. We need to be wise. We need to do our job the best we can to gain the victory.
But UK intelligence says Russia is planning a fresh wave of assaults. This video was released by the Russian army. They purport it shows their troops on the move on the outskirts of Kyiv. US defence officials say some Russian contingents are now just 9 miles away. Other major cities are also under attack. Captured on CCTV this morning, Sky News has verified this video from just before 6 a.m. There's no obvious military target here. This was a shoe factory. Now it's embers and ash. As air raid sirens blare, civilians here scramble for safety underground. More than 2 million people have now fled Ukraine. Those still here in besieged cities like the northern Kyiv find shelter wherever they can. In the southern port city of Mariupol, there is yet another attempt at establishing a humanitarian corridor to help hundreds of thousands of people safely escape a place where there's no food and no fuel.
The Russian army continues to do airstrikes, air bombing, artillery shelling, and their troops are behind the city. And in some districts of the city, we have street battles. So as you understand, the humanitarian situation decreases hour by hour, second by second.
Ukrainian officials today appealed yet again for international military might to maintain a no-fly zone. The US president, though, clear and firm they wouldn't support one.
We'll defend every single inch of NATO territory with the full might of the united and galvanized NATO. We will not fight a war against Russia in Ukraine. Direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is World War III, something we must strive to prevent.
But as families cower in basements, there's the spectre of further atrocities. Russia says the US has been making biological weapons in Ukrainian labs, claims the US and UK say are a fake story to cloak a possible chemical attack of Russia's own. A fake story with very real victims, living in places where aid can't get in and from where they can't get out. Katerina Vitozzi, Sky News.
Well, our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, is in Lviv in western Ukraine for us this evening. Deborah, what more can you tell us then about these reports of a fresh wave of attacks by Russia, Russia really ramping up the pressure?
Yes, well, I went to visit the site of one of the attacks in the west. We've had, over the last more than 2 weeks now of this war, the focus of the Russian attack or offensive has been in the south, in the east and in the north, obviously encircling Kyiv, the capital. But overnight last night, well, in the early hours of this morning, actually, about sort of 5:45 this morning, there was airstrikes against 2 military airfields in the west of the country. So an expansion, really, of the targeting. The belief is that it's a sign that Russia is trying to take out the Ukrainian ability to use its air force against Russian targets, which has been something that Russia has failed to do since the start of the invasion. But also some are interpreting this as a signal that that nowhere in this country is safe. The West has been more of a safe haven. Here in Lviv, it's been a real transit hub for those more than 1.5 million refugees, many of them coming through this point to get into next door Poland. So an expansion there. And then also, in terms of the actual war itself and who's involved in it, there are real concerns from the Ukrainian side tonight that Belarus might be about to get involved. You've had reports over the last few days of concern over the posturing of Belarusian soldiers, paratroopers, on the border with Ukraine. Belarus, a close ally, one of the closest allies that Russia has in the region. And tonight, a warning that they might be launching some offensive round about now. The time that was given by the Ukrainians was 9 o'clock local time, which is now. They said they accused Russia of launching attacks from Ukrainian airspace using Russian jets against Belarusian villages on the border, and saying that that could be some kind of provocation. We've yet to see if that would happen. The Belarusian president has denied that his country would get involved, but his country, frankly, is already involved in terms of allowing its soil to be used for Russian troops to launch their invasion and also to launch missiles against Ukraine. So it's already been sanctioned because of that. But that potentially, if that were to happen, that would be a serious deepening and widening of this conflict, bringing in a whole other country, albeit one very much under the influence of Russia, into the conflict too.
OK, Deborah in Lviv, thank you. And the latest developments in the Russian offensive will feature in Saturday's papers. We'll have our extended press preview and news review from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be Daily Mirror columnist Susie Boniface and assistant comment editor at the Daily Telegraph, Madeline Grant. Well, taking over the city of Odesa in the south of Ukraine is seen as one of Russia's next strategic goals. Civilians are joining in with the efforts to defend the city against an amphibious attack that could be imminent. Sky's Nick Martin is in Odesa, from where he sent this report.
On the beaches of Odesa, they're preparing to defend themselves. They know the Russians aren't far away now. And who could have predicted this? A choir provides a wartime serenade to volunteers. Everyone here just wants to survive. Odesa is a major port on the Black Sea, strategically important to Vladimir Putin. His invasion, though, has brought life to a standstill here. And precious monuments are now shrouded in sandbags.
Just a little over 3 weeks ago, it was bustling here. You know, Odesa's famous for its cafes and its restaurants and its sort of boutique shops. But now it's absolutely deserted. And the one thing that strikes you on every street corner are the barricades. And behind me is the famous opera house here in Odesa. The last time it was protected like this was the Second World War. History really is repeating itself.
On the street, we meet an elderly couple, and I want to know what they think about Russia's chances here.
Odessa, no-go Russian army. No go.
They'll not get through.
Only back in Russia.
Daniel was born in Odesa. His wife and children have now fled, and he's staying to fight.
Think you can hold back this Russian offensive?
Sure. We already shown since 24th that we're holding back, and we kicked some ass, sorry, but we kicked some ass.
In Odesa's trendy food hall, they've turned it into an aid station. Inga, a lawyer, is organising the effort.
What's your message to Vladimir Putin?
Only one message: stop the war. It's our country. Go away. Just doing anything with your Russia. Everything you want, but never come again Ukraine. We hate you and all the politics. We don't need your support.
And then a reminder of the dangers here.
So while we were in here about to do an interview, the air raid sirens have gone off, so everyone's been asked to go down into the shelter, so they're leaving this area now.
A guy grabs a guitar and begins to play. No one here knows what's going to happen next. Nick Martin, Sky News, Odesa.
Well, the United Nations Security Council has held another emergency session today, with Russia making unsubstantiated claims that Ukraine is developing chemical weapons. Earlier, the Russian delegate was speaking and brandished some images relating to the airstrike on the maternity hospital in Mariupol.
The fighters, the radicals, converted that building into an attack base. This is something that we warned about even that. But apparently you don't listen, or you don't hear what it is that we say. Did you see the photos of the allegedly destroyed maternity hospital, the building of the hospital destroyed by a bomb? What you can see there is a building without windows, but it's not destroyed. Here are the photos. Can you imagine what would have happened to a building if it underwent a bomb strike or shelling, as well as to those who were inside the building? What would have happened to it? So we have the videos from inside the building. Here they are. And they show that there is disorder, overturned furniture, and untouched, intact chairs. Once again, can you imagine what kind of destruction would have remained in the wake of a building hit by a rocket or a bomb?
Well, at the meeting, both the US representative Linda Thomas-Greenfield and UK representative Dame Barbara Woodward reiterated their belief that Russia was using these unsubstantiated claims as an excuse to launch a chemical weapons attack in Ukraine.
I will say this once. Ukraine does not have a biological weapons program. There are no Ukrainian biological weapons laboratories supported by the United States. We have serious concerns that Russia may be planning to use chemical or biological agents against the Ukrainian people. The intent behind these lies seem clear, and it is deeply troubling.
Russia has today brought into the Security Council a series of wild, completely baseless, and irresponsible conspiracy theories. Let me put it diplomatically. They are utter nonsense.
Our US correspondent Greg Milam is in Washington for us. Greg, another UN meeting. Many will say lots of talking, lots of discussion, but actually, is there any action?
Well, this was a meeting called by Russia, and in many respects, it's what the UK and the US has been warning Russia would do for a number of days. The Prime Minister yesterday, of course, speaking to Sky News about this suggestion that Russia would allege that the US and Ukraine were developing biological weapons, dismissing, as you heard there, dismissing that as the truth, but saying Russia would use that as a pretext to carry out a chemical weapons attack of its own. And the US ambassador there saying that even holding this meeting was in many ways a false flag, a pretext that Russia was trying to create to justify whatever they might do, and saying that it's Russia that has the well-documented history of using chemical weapons, supporting President Assad in Syria and his use of chemical weapons. They have a biological program, the US says, that violates international law. And these allegations from Russia have been around for a long time, but they really ramped up in the days before the invasion to create that pretext. The question is, what will the West do about it? Joe Biden was speaking earlier today, unveiling some new sanctions. He said if chemical weapons were used, there would be a severe price for Russia. But we don't know what that is. And remember, he was vice president when Barack Obama talked about red lines over chemical weapons in Syria, and they didn't take the action that people expected.
Greg, in Washington, thank you. Well, despite the continuing escalation in the conflict, Vladimir Putin said today that there are certain positive developments in talks between Russia and Ukraine. That assessment came as he met his ally, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, in Moscow. But in the latest clampdown on access to foreign media within Russia, the social media giant Meta, the parent group of Facebook, was labelled an extremist organisation after the company said it would temporarily allow people to post calls calling for Vladimir Putin's death. Our Moscow correspondent Diana Magnay has more.
Russia's Minister of Defence Sergei Shoigu distributing medals for bravery. Pictures released for domestic consumption to rally the people behind what Russia refuses to call anything other than a special military operation. These soldiers made it back from the front. Others have not. But it's a criminal offence in Russia to report anything other than the official number, which was 498 on March the 2nd and has not been updated since. According to Mr. Shoigu, the operation is going to plan. In a meeting of the Security Council, he told Russia's president that there were 16,000 requests from so-called volunteers in the Middle East who wanted to help liberate, in his words, the people of Donbass. A claim quickly backed up by this video from Russia's Ministry of Defence of fighters chanting their support for the Syrian president and for Russia.
Если вы видите, что есть люди, которые хотят на добровольной основе, тем более не за деньги, приехать и оказать помощь людям, проживающим на Донбассе, ну что же, надо пойти им навстречу и помочь им перебраться в зону боевых действий.
Vladimir Putin went on to meet his Belarusian counterpart, Alexander Lukashenko, a frequent visitor to the Kremlin these days, who declared that Russia had acted not a moment too soon.
Не мы развязали эту войну, у нас совесть чиста. Хорошо, что начали. Биологическое оружие, самые большие электростанции атомные. И все это было готово взорваться.
As both leaders reassured the other that they'd weather the sanctions storm, the US imposed additional measures, removing Russia's most favoured nation trading status, banning further imports and the export of luxury goods to Russia. Luxury here has already shut down. The symbols of what it meant to get rich in the 90s and the early years of Putin's reign all pulling out. Instagram was banned today, the symbols of connectivity in modern Russia shutting down one by one. In Soviet times, people tended to talk about the system only in the safety of their own kitchens. It was too dangerous to disagree publicly. And it feels a bit as though Russia is returning to that state, with the Kremlin today with this message to anyone who might disagree with what they are doing. A true Russian is never ashamed of being Russian. If anyone says so, this person is not Russian. This person is not with us. Many thousands of Russians have left the country over the last 2 weeks. Sanctions will rip away the futures that the rest expected they'd have, even if many may not really know it yet. Dana Magne, Sky News, Moscow.
This is a Sky News special programme on the war in Ukraine. Coming up after the break, we'll take a look at new plans to help British people open up their homes to Ukrainian refugees. Welcome back. The UK government is set to announce proposals to allow British people to open their homes to Ukrainians fleeing the Russian invasion. The new scheme, expected to be confirmed next week, will create a new sponsored humanitarian route for those Ukrainians without family links here in the UK. It comes after Boris Johnson came under increasing pressure across the political spectrum for failing to do enough to help refugees from the conflict. Sky's Becky Johnson reports.
We hope and pray that God gives you the strength and courage to face these awful times. We stand with you.
She's collected hundreds of messages and raised thousands of pounds to send to Ukraine, but Lisa Kay wants to do more. This room is all ready for 2 children. A British family who fled from Kyiv will arrive at her home in Warwickshire this weekend. She wants to give her other spare rooms to Ukrainians.
I'd like to be able to look after them. I think they've been through absolute hell. And for me, it makes me feel guilty that I can just sit here and have all this space. And then there's those people that have had to leave, like their dads and brothers and uncles and grandfathers behind. It just really, really gets to me.
The government says it'll set out more detail in the coming days about how British people will be able to offer up their homes to Ukrainian refugees. But it follows heavy criticism of the Home Office for the delays and red tape being faced by people trying to get into this country. At this refugee support centre, they have many questions.
We don't know the logistics of this scheme yet. And we don't know the eligibility criteria, how long they will be able to stay in the UK, hopefully access to employment, study and benefits, and even better refugee status, support to find employment, registering with the GPs, school places for their children.
This is my granddad, grandma, my aunt.
The details will matter to families like Julia's. Their hometown now in Russian control. They escaped to Poland and are waiting to see if the UK will allow them in. She has this plea.
Please make it faster, because it's very time-consuming for elderly people and people with children, like in my case. Let them come, and then I'm sure that all of the documentation can be handed in the UK already, where they're safe.
The British public have already shown their willingness to help. Will that extend to opening their homes to those most in need? Becky Johnson, Sky News in the West Midlands.
And our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, is with me here in the studio. And Sam, we're expecting a big announcement from the government on Monday, aren't we, about the whole refugee situation?
That's right. Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, is in the lead. He's going to announce this resettlement package, people being able to open their homes to people coming from Ukraine do their part in this big effort. And underpinning it, essentially, is going to be a second route for people to come in from Ukraine. At the moment, you can come in effectively if you have a permanent visa and you come from Ukraine, you can bring in your extended family. So there's a family route. From Monday, there is going to be a sponsorship route. So what that means is that if a local authority or an individual agrees that they're going to house you, look after you, then you will be allowed to enter. The details of how this will work will be complicated, and that's what Michael Gove has been setting out. Now, the government's come under fire in recent days because some of this stuff, there's been criticism from the opposition parties that it wasn't fast enough. Quite a lot of fire aimed, actually, at the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, who has been cast in some quarters as not being generous enough to refugees. What's interesting, we've been speaking to people across government today at Sky, and what's interesting is that actually Priti Patel in some cases has been pushing for schemes that were going to be a bit more open to more people coming from Ukraine. But the block actually came, in some cases, in number 10, the number 10 policy unit and others just going, hang on a moment, we want to make sure everybody's properly checked. We've got to be careful about exactly what we're opening the doors to. So perhaps not quite the politics that some were expecting in that, but we will get details on what number 10 think are a very generous new scheme when Michael Gove stands up in the House of Commons on Monday. OK, we'll find out more then. Sam, thank you for the moment. You're watching a Sky News special programme on the war in Ukraine. Coming up, after Ukrainian forces show off captured Russian vehicles, I'll be talking to a former US ambassador to Ukraine about the latest developments in the conflict. This is a Sky News special programme on the war in Ukraine. Our top stories this evening. A senior US defence source says Russian forces have advanced 3 miles closer to Kyiv in the last 24 hours. At the United Nations, America has dismissed claims by Russia that it's helping Ukraine make chemical and biological weapons. And the UN says more than 2.5 million people have now fled Ukraine. The UK government is planning a new scheme to help British people take in refugees. Well, I can speak now to John Herbst, former US ambassador to Ukraine and now director of the Eurasia Centre at the Atlantic Council. Good to see you this evening. Thank you very much for your time. And perhaps we can just start with your thoughts 16 days in to this conflict. What is Russia's position tonight? There's talk of a fresh wave of attacks coming and also Belarus getting involved.
OK, look, the Russian offensive in Ukraine has gone much worse than anticipated. They have largely been bogged down around Mariupol, around Kharkiv, around Kyiv. It is true, though, that over the past, 24, 36, 72 hours, we've seen some real movement in the south and some movement around Kyiv. But they've only taken, at this point, almost 2.5 weeks into their major invasion, one significant Ukrainian city, Kherson, in the south. Even though they've actually been surrounding Mariupol since almost before this new invasion began, they still haven't taken the city. What this means is that they're starting to use the barbaric tactics that they used in Chechnya and in northern Syria, which is massive bombardment of civilian areas. I'd say not so much without regard for civilian lives, but to kill civilians as well as to kill soldiers, and that way to bomb their opponents into submission. This, of course, is a war crime, as is their use of thermobaric or vacuum bombs and their use of cluster bombs.
When you hear President Zelenskyy say, as he has done in the last 24 hours, that Ukraine has reached a strategic turning point, he's convinced that Ukraine can win, but that surely is wishful thinking, certainly if NATO doesn't do any more.
Well, actually, no. I think that, in fact, Ukraine is likely to win this conflict. But the question is, how many more tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians must die before that becomes clear to the rulers in the Kremlin? right now you have a war of one man, Vladimir Putin, on a whole people, the Ukrainian people. It's pretty clear from watching that bizarre video when Putin announced his intention to move, and then watching his bizarre video when he announced raising nuclear alert, that even his most senior advisors are uncomfortable with this. And by launching this major invasion, Putin has greatly weakened Russia economically and geopolitically. He has united Europe and NATO in ways he did not anticipate. Even Germany now understands that Putin is a threat to world peace. And he has brought on his head and on Russia's head sanctions which will crush the Russian economy, and in the middle term and in the long term, even the Russian military. Because without a real resources, it's hard to keep your military in shape. The only real question now is, again, how much pain is he going to inflict on Ukraine before his war there is understood to be a failure? He can reduce Ukrainian cities to rubble. He can take more parts of the country. He will never, however, control more than the cities and the roads. He'll haste if he actually significantly reduces the Ukrainian military. He hasn't done that yet, which is also an important achievement. He will face a partisan war, which will take Russian lives, Russian soldiers' lives, ad infinitum. And at some point, the Russian people will realize this is a loser of a war. And even the Russian elite, intimidated by their increasingly authoritarian leader, will understand that Putin's policies are a disaster for Russia.
So in the long term, this is the demise of President Putin. That seems to be what you're saying. But in the short term, the Ukrainians are going to be pummeled, aren't they, in coming days and weeks? You wrote, I think, I'm right in saying that you were part of a letter to President Biden asking for more to be done. What did you mean by that? What exactly were you asking for?
Look, the Biden team deserves credit for accurately seeing the Russian threat and laying out, I would say, a solid framework for addressing it and mitigating it. But in actual implementation, they've been slow and timid. I would say that's especially true on the military side. They talked back in the spring, a year ago, when you had the first Russian buildup, about providing additional arms to Ukraine. They didn't do it in the spring after the Russian drawdown. They only began to do it in connection with this crisis in late January. We should have been sending additional arms to Ukraine back in certainly November or December, well before this new Russian invasion began. And even after the decision to send additional arms to Ukraine, we waited till the end of January to send our first Stinger missile to Ukraine. That's a disgrace. And now you had the disgraceful decision by the administration not to expedite the sending of MiGs from our NATO allies into Ukraine. And they did it, frankly, because they were afraid of, quote unquote, the escalatory effect. As Moscow is bombing the hell out of Ukrainian civilians, they're talking about sending warplanes to Ukraine as, quote unquote, an escalation. That is timidity parading as prudence.
But isn't the problem that, who decides what an escalation is? We don't know what Putin's thinking, and his behaviour has been so erratic and so delusional in many ways. He may well see that as an escalation.
Well, I would hope he does see it as an indication of American intent to defeat him, and not just American intent, NATO intent to help Ukraine defeat him in Ukraine. Look at the logic of your question. If we say, well, gee, Mr. Putin may escalate, therefore we have to hold our own responses. We're not only handing Ukraine to Putin, we're handing the Baltic states. The same logic would apply if Putin has his designs on the Baltic states. And why would he think that Chapter 5 would save the Baltic states if he sees us cower in responding to his clearly inhumane war in Ukraine?
So you're saying that we're almost being held hostage by our decision not to enforce a no-fly zone, for example?
That's correct. And look, Russia today is a great danger, principally because Putin is a serial provocateur. The Soviet Union was a much greater threat to the United States, yet we were able to stand up to the Soviets, going toe-to-toe, without actually shooting, over the Berlin crisis in '61, even more over the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. There was no nuclear holocaust. What emboldens Putin is Western weakness. West did nothing after Georgia was attacked by Russia in '08. We did almost nothing after Crimea was attacked. We began to do something after the war in Donbass began in 2014, but not enough. And while we've done a great deal now, and again, you have to credit Biden with that, we have not done enough. You know, if we had sent, when Ukraine asked years ago, anti-ship missiles to Ukraine, Russia would not have made all that progress in the south. They would not be bombing Odesa. If we had sent anti-air missiles, not just Stingers, but more powerful missiles to Ukraine when they asked years ago, the Russian bombardment over Kharkiv, over Kyiv would be far less. Our timidity has only emboldened Putin's worst tendencies. He has one great advantage or two great advantages in this war. One, of course, he's a peer nuclear power of the United States, and he likes to threaten the West with that. And two, he has a KGB operative's nose for weakness. And he smells when he can intimidate his opponents. And he's smelling intimidation right now. And why do we want to feed that? I just don't know.
Fascinating listening to you. You seem to be echoing quite a lot of what President Zelenskyy has said in recent days. Ambassador John Herbst, thank you very much indeed for your time. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Well, more than 2.5 million people have now fled Ukraine since the Russian invasion started on the 24th of February. An exodus which is contributing to a growing humanitarian crisis, both within Ukraine as well as in neighbouring countries. One of them, Poland, has seen more than 1.5 million refugees enter their country alone. Well, Sky's Lisa Holland reports now from Warsaw.
As I said, this is what we organise temporarily.
This is just one of the dozens and dozens of refugee shelters being set up in Warsaw. A welcome camp bed after the bunkers and the bombs and the days of travel.
Ukraine, I love you. I love you.
They long to be home, but family after family tells of the trauma of escaping war. Yulia struggled to reach Kyiv train station with her daughter, who has epilepsy, and her son, who's autistic. What can I say, she says. It was so hard trying to hold my children's hands in case they fell and carry the luggage. Then she reveals 11-year-old Nikita is recovering from an operation after being born with deformed feet. She got here guiding one of her children who's barely able to walk. Others at the shelter need medical help. A young girl is on a drip, dehydrated after the exhaustion of the journey to Poland, now made by 1.5 million people.
So the problem now, because so many refugees have come to the Polish capital, and because the authorities are so stretched, they're having to provide more permanent accommodation or bus people to other Polish cities.
This refugee crisis is defined as an exodus of women and children. Across the city, there are makeshift nurseries to entertain the youngsters. And women, distraught, they've left husbands, brothers and fathers behind in Ukraine. Anna's left her husband in Kyiv. She also has to contend with a mother-in-law in Russia who refuses to accept why she's fled to Poland.
She said, oh, it's just a little, not big situation. It's just a little. He said, Mom, we had no house. Russian is destroy our house.
Across Poland, thousands of people who needed no persuasion of the horrors of this war are taking in refugees. English teacher Victor Johnson and his wife offered a home to Marta and her grandchildren. Both of the children's parents are still in Ukraine.
I didn't speak to Marta before she came here. She just turned up in the car. And so we met them with high fives and hugs, invited them in, made them feel at home. And that was the most important thing, that they felt safe, secure.
We asked Roman how he's settling in, all things considered.
Okay.
Nice.
Just one example of the kindness of strangers in the midst of war. Lisa Holland, Sky News, Warsaw.
You're watching a Sky News special programme on the war in Ukraine. Coming up in a moment, should the West be tougher in standing up to Russian aggression? I'll discuss that with a Ukrainian-American international lawyer.